May 1945. The war had finally ended, but for those who stepped off the freight train that morning in the Texas heat, surrender did not feel like peace. The doors screeched open, and the smell of rust, sweat, and distant pine filled the air. German women, young, pale, their hair matted from days in transit, descended one by one, each clutching a bundle of cloth that could have been clothing, a keepsake or a child. Their eyes were hollow from hunger and disbelief. They had been told Americans would humiliate them, perhaps starve them for revenge. Instead, what they saw made them freeze. The guards waiting at the platform were calm, even courteous. A medic in khaki offered a canteen. A nurse in a spotless white uniform motioned toward a row of waiting trucks. Somewhere, someone laughed. It was the first sound of ordinary life these women had heard in years. The convoy rolled through the open Texas plains. Barbed wire fences glinted in the distance, surrounding Camp Hearn. Inside the trucks, the women sat silently, each wrapped in her own thoughts. A few touched their stomachs instinctively, some swollen with pregnancy, others flat but remembering. The war had taken everything from them, their homes, their husbands, the future of their unborn children. Yet here they were, prisoners of the very nation their government had taught them to hate. A wind swept dust across the road, warm and dry as the American sun. One woman whispered in disbelief, "It smells clean here." The camp looked more like a small town than a prison. Rows of wooden barracks stood neatly along gravel paths. There were gardens, even a small theater once used by German officers. The guards didn't bark orders. They gestured, speaking in measured English that most of the women couldn't understand but somehow didn't fear. When the truck stopped, one soldier jumped down and extended his hand to help them out. His uniform bore the insignia of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. He spoke softly, "You're safe now." The words carried no sentimentality, just fact. It was the kind of decency that disarmed more effectively than any weapon. Inside the infirmary, the air was cool and faintly sweet with the scent of antiseptic. Beds were lined with clean white sheets, sunlight spilling across them through screen windows. 4 women who had slept on straw beside artillery shells or in bombed-out ruins, it looked impossible. One woman, no older than 24, ran her hand across the fabric and began to cry quietly. Another, heavily pregnant, looked suspicious. "Why?" she asked in broken English. The nurse beside her smiled faintly. "Because you need rest." These were not ordinary prisoners of war. Most of the men, over 425,000 of them, were soldiers sent to U.S. camps after capture in Europe. But these women were anomalies, civilians swept up in surrender, some of them wives of soldiers, some clerks or nurses, a few who had fled labor camps and were now categorized as miscellaneous captives. A handful carried infants born during evacuation. Records from the War Department barely mention them. Yet in this quiet Texas camp, the American military suddenly faced a moral puzzle. What do you do with pregnant prisoners of a defeated enemy? The question might have remained bureaucratic if not for the unmistakable human truth in front of them. One afternoon, an Army nurse named Evelyn Parker found herself holding the wrist of a woman whose pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. The woman's name was Anneliese, 26, from Bremen. She was 7 months pregnant and dangerously malnourished. Parker wrote in her journal later that night, "She tried to refuse water, as if expecting poison. I told her, drink. This isn't a trick." She wept and asked where her husband was. I had no answer. Outside the camp, the war's echoes were still loud, newspapers blared headlines of liberation and atrocity. Photographs of Bergen-Belsen and Dachau horrified the American public. Yet inside these fences, the situation was quietly reversed. The supposed enemy now slept under the protection of the U.S. flag. It was a paradox that unsettled both sides. The guards, mostly young Americans from farms and cities, stared at their prisoners with uneasy compassion. "They looked like my sister," one private recalled years later. Only thinner. Food became the first bridge. Each morning, the women lined up for rations. Bread, boiled eggs, coffee, sometimes even butter. The meals were standardized, matching the caloric intake of American soldiers, as required by the Geneva Convention. Still, many of the women hesitated to eat. One nurse reported that several tried to give their portions to the guards, assuming it was a test. But hunger and exhaustion eventually won. Within days, color returned to their faces. A few began to speak softly among themselves, comparing memories of home, births, losses. At night, when the camp quieted, the sounds were strange. The rustle of leaves, distant laughter from the guards' quarters, a gramophone playing a Glenn Miller record. Some of the women lay awake, their minds torn between fear and gratitude. America, one whispered, as if the word itself were a question. In Germany, propaganda had painted the Americans as monsters. Yet here, the monsters had handed them blankets and soap. It was a confusion too large to name. Days passed, and with them came subtle changes. The women began to walk outside their barracks, helping each other wash clothes or write letters. A few were allowed to work in the camp kitchens or gardens. The guards grew used to them, and occasionally a soldier would stop to hand over a cigarette or a candy bar, half awkward, half kind. One nurse remembered a moment that broke her composure completely, a German woman offering her a flower grown near the fence, saying simply, "For peace." But beneath these small acts of mercy, a quiet moral tension deepened. The U.S. Army was rationing milk across the country. American children were drinking powdered substitutes. Yet here, deep in Texas, medics debated whether to request extra dairy and vitamins for the unborn children of their captives. Some officers argued it was unnecessary. Others insisted it was duty. "We can't win the war and lose our humanity," one medical officer wrote in a memo. The debate went up the chain of command and settled, eventually, in favor of compassion. That decision changed everything. On the morning of June 2nd, a military truck arrived at Camp Hearn carrying crates marked medical supplies, infant rations. The pregnant women were gathered in the infirmary. The same nurse, Parker, wheeled in a cart covered with glass bottles filled with white liquid. She began handing them out one by one. The women stared as if she were offering them treasure. One finally asked, voice trembling, "For our babies?" Parker nodded. "For your babies," she said. A stunned silence filled the room before the sound of weeping began again, soft, disbelieving, not from fear this time, but from something almost forgotten, hope. For the first time since the Reich had fallen, these women realized they were not merely prisoners. They were human beings again, protected, fed, and cared for by those they had called enemies. Outside, the Texas wind carried the faint scent of dust and wildflowers across the barbed wire. Somewhere beyond, a train whistle blew, calling another convoy from another battlefield. The war was over, but its moral reckoning had only begun. And inside that quiet camp, with bottles of milk lined up like symbols of an unspoken truce, one question began to haunt both captor and captive alike. How far should mercy go, when the enemy is no longer armed but simply alive? The sun rose hot and white over Camp Hearn, turning the barbed wire into lines of light. Inside the infirmary, the day began with the measured rhythm of wartime mercy. Nurses washing hands, medics counting doses, and the hum of refrigeration units preserving what little penicillin the army had left. Bottles of milk, real milk, not powdered, stood in rows like a silent promise. Each morning, Nurse Evelyn Parker checked the ration ledger and shook her head at the numbers. "It's more than they give to local schools," she murmured. Yet she followed orders, filling bottles one by one, because command had made its decision. The unborn would be treated as protected lives. No exceptions. To outsiders, it looked like madness. The U.S. had just lost over 400,000 of its own soldiers. Across the Atlantic, Europe was rubble and starvation. But within this Texas camp, the U.S. Army Medical Corps had become custodian to a moral experiment no one had planned, a test of how far compassion could stretch in the aftermath of war. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment for all prisoners, but it said nothing about pregnant women, nothing about newborns born behind wire. The men in Washington called it a gray area. The nurses on the ground simply called it life. Every decision carried weight. Each ration of milk had to be justified. Every ampoule of penicillin accounted for. Parker kept her logbook in tight script, listing the German mothers by number, not by name, though she learned them anyway. Subject 174B, Annalise. Subject 203F, Marta. To headquarters, they were data. To her, they were faces, some young and trembling, others quiet with the stoicism of those who had buried too many already. By late June, the pregnancies advanced. The camp's medical staff converted one barack into a makeshift maternity ward. They hung curtains for privacy, built wooden cribs from spare lumber, and painted the walls a pale yellow. It was the kind of detail no one would ever include in a military report, yet it mattered. When the first child was born, a girl, the guards outside paused to listen. The cry was thin, startled, alive. Parker wrapped the infant in an American Red Cross blanket and whispered, "Welcome to the winning side." It was a joke, but her voice shook. Rumors of these births began to circulate through the camp system. Some officers called it the baby problem. Others saw it as a quiet victory of American principle. Lieutenant Colonel Harris, the camp commander, wrote to his superior, "We are producing life under conditions of defeat. I believe this will stand as the measure of what separates civilization from vengeance." His words circulated through the Army network, half admired, half mocked. One quartermaster reportedly replied, "You can't feed compassion to the taxpayers." The women, for their part, lived in a strange duality, grateful for safety yet haunted by shame. To be cared for by the enemy was a humiliation they could not reconcile. Some refused to learn English. Others began to mimic the nurses' mannerisms, their calm gestures and gentle humor. Annalise, whose child was due in July, would sit by the window tracing her belly with her fingertips, listening to the Americans' country music on the radio. She once asked Parker, "Do your people hate us?" Parker had paused before answering. "Not all of us. Some just don't know what to feel anymore." Outside the camp, the American public was less forgiving. Local newspapers carried stories of enemy women receiving luxury rations. Letters poured into military offices. Angry farmers asking why German babies drank American milk while their own families rationed sugar. The War Department issued a terse statement. Humanitarian aid was a matter of international law. But the truth ran deeper. This wasn't just legality, it was identity. America needed to prove, even to itself, that victory hadn't cost its soul. The tension filtered down to the nurses. At dinner one night, Parker overheard two medics arguing in low voices. "Why waste supplies on them? They'll go home and raise little Nazis." The other shook his head. "Maybe. Or maybe they'll remember this." That exchange stayed with her. It wasn't just about milk or medicine, it was about who they would become after the war, on both sides of the wire. Each birth seemed to reinforce the question. When Marta's baby came early, the doctor feared the worst. Supplies were thin, the infant too small. Parker stayed up through the night, dripping milk with a spoon into the child's mouth, refusing to let it fade. At dawn, the baby took a single steady breath and began to cry. The entire infirmary exhaled. Later, when she recorded the event in her log, Parker hesitated before writing the final detail. "Infant survived." She underlined it twice. In the days that followed, the maternity ward became a place of uneasy miracles. American nurses and German mothers coexisted in a kind of fragile peace. No politics, no orders, just the rhythm of feeding, cleaning, breathing. The women began to laugh again, timidly at first, then freely. Some of the guards brought small gifts, apples, soap, magazines. There was an unspoken understanding that inside those walls, the war had briefly lost its authority. Still, the contradiction gnawed at everyone. While these mothers received medical care, newsreels from Europe showed skeletal survivors stumbling through concentration camp. Mercy in one camp existed alongside horror in another. The irony was almost unbearable. "Maybe this is how history balances itself," Parker wrote in a letter she never sent. "We destroy in one hemisphere and heal in the other." Summer deepened. The camp's vegetable garden flourished under the Texas sun, and the women were occasionally allowed to walk its edges. One morning, Parker watched as a soldier passed a blooming sunflower through the fence to Annalise, who placed it in a jar beside her bed. When her baby was born 2 weeks later, she named her son, Sunday. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The staff joked that Camp Hearn now had its own war bride of peace. By September, word reached the camp that some POWs were being repatriated. The women began to wonder what would happen to them and their newborns. Would they be sent home to ruined cities, to families that might not want them anymore? Or would they remain under the custody of a nation that had both defeated and saved them? Even Parker didn't know. Orders shifted weekly. Rumors said the War Department wanted to close the maternity ward to streamline operations. Compassion, it seemed, had an expiration date. One evening, as the sun sank over the Texas plains, Parker stood by the fence watching fireflies rise above the grass. A German mother approached, her baby asleep against her chest. "When we go," she asked softly, "will you forget us?" Parker smiled faintly, eyes wet with fatigue. "No," she said. "That's not how mercy works." For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The world outside the fence was moving on. Europe rebuilding, soldiers returning home, the war stories already turning to legend. But here, in this quiet outpost of decency, the moral weight of victory lingered. The babies slept. The milk cooled. The ledger remained open. And as night settled over Camp Hearn, Evelyn Parker wrote a final note in her book before closing it. "Mercy is the only thing we can't ration." What she didn't know was that the policy itself was about to change. Washington was growing impatient with compassion, and the next telegram would carry a new order, one that would test whether the American experiment in mercy could survive peace itself. The nights at Camp Hearn grew quieter after the babies came, but not peaceful. The hum of crickets replaced the echo of boots, and in that silence, unease began to stir. Word of the Mercy Camp had reached the towns beyond the wire, whispered first through soldiers' letters, then printed in the Dallas Morning News. Headlines called it the nursery for Nazis. The phrase struck like a slap. Local families, still grieving their sons lost in Europe, read that German women were being given milk, medicine, and beds, luxuries some Texans themselves lacked. Soon, the camp gates became the border between compassion and outrage. Inside, Nurse Evelyn Parker moved through her rounds as if balancing on a tightrope. She had seen kindness heal wounds that medicine couldn't touch, but now she felt the weight of judgment pressing from beyond the fence. Letters arrived daily, some addressed to the camp commander, some to the nurses directly. "Stop wasting supplies on the enemy," one read. Another asked, "Whose child will go hungry so theirs can live?" Parker folded them silently into her pocket, refusing to let the women see. Mercy, she realized, had become its own scandal. The German mothers noticed the shift before anyone spoke of it. Guards who once offered smiles now kept their distance. The camp's atmosphere, once quietly humane, began to harden. A rumor spread that the maternity ward would be shut down. "They say America is tired of us," murmured Marta one afternoon as she rocked her infant in a wooden cradle. Annalise, sitting nearby, brushed her fingers over her daughter's downy hair. "America never knew us," she said softly. Tension thickened like humidity. Each act of kindness began to feel fragile, temporary. Supplies dwindled as shipments were rerouted to reconstruction efforts in Europe. The milk truck arrived late, then not at all. When Parker inquired, the quartermaster shrugged. "Orders," he said. "You're to substitute with rations." Powdered formula replaced fresh milk. The women grimaced at the taste but said nothing. Gratitude, once freely given, turned into silent endurance. Beyond the wire, resentment grew louder. A town meeting in Hearn turned hostile when a reporter mentioned that POW infants were receiving American penicillin. "My boy died in Italy waiting for that stuff," one man shouted. "Now we're handing it out to Germans?" Another woman stood, voice trembling. "Maybe God wants us to be better than what we fought." The room fell into uneasy silence, but her words didn't make it into the paper. Headlines favored anger. It sold better. Within the camp, the guards began to whisper among themselves. They were young, barely men, and war had left them disillusioned. One night, Parker overheard two of them near the infirmary steps. "You ever think we're coddling them?" one asked. The other hesitated. "Maybe. But it's strange seeing them like this. They cry the same way our women do." Parker stepped into the light deliberately, making her presence known. "That's because pain doesn't wear a uniform," she said. The soldiers stiffened, then nodded, embarrassed. Still, the tide was turning. The Army's new directives came coded in bureaucratic language: resource optimization, post-conflict demobilization. But to Parker they meant only one thing: less mercy. One by one, privileges disappeared. The maternity ward's curtains were removed. Work details were reinstated for mothers able to labor. The air of quiet compassion was replaced by the hum of regulations. The German women felt the shift in their bones. They had once been prisoners of war, now they were prisoners of resentment. Annalise began to keep a diary, scrawling on scraps of paper torn from ration boxes. "They gave us hope, and now they take it back," she wrote. "Perhaps mercy is just another weapon. They give it to you until it hurts. And yet, even as conditions worsened, humanity refused to die. Parker continued her work with stubborn tenderness. She smuggled extra blankets from the officers' quarters, passed apples to the women during inspections, and spoke softly to the infants in English lullabies. One night, she found Marta standing by the fence, staring toward the lights of town. "What are you thinking?" Parker asked. Marta smiled faintly. "That freedom and prison are not places," she said. "They are moods." In early October, a telegram arrived from Washington. Several camps were to begin phased closures, and all non-essential medical programs would cease. The maternity ward at Herne was listed among them. The order was signed and stamped before anyone could protest. Parker felt her stomach sink as she read it. To the men who signed it, it was a line of text. To her, it was 30 mothers and their children, still fragile and needing care. She folded the paper and slipped it into her coat, delaying the inevitable announcement. The next morning, she gathered the women outside the infirmary. The sun was blinding, and the wind carried the dry scent of approaching winter. "They'll be transferring you soon," she said carefully. "To other facilities." The words sounded hollow even to her, its beds stripped bare, curtains removed, cribs empty. Dust gathered where life had once cried out in tiny gasps. Nurse Evelyn Parker walked through the ward each morning before sunrise, a habit she couldn't break. She would trace her fingers over the window frame, stare at the ghostly imprint of where bottles once stood in rows, and listen to nothing. The babies were gone, their mothers transferred, the experiment in mercy concluded. Only paperwork remained, stamped and filed, proof that the U.S. had extended humanity to its former enemies, and then, politely, withdrawn it. Still, something lingered. Letters began arriving from Europe, smuggled through Red Cross channels. They were written in shaky German script, signed with names Parker now knew by heart. "We arrived safely. Bremen is rubble. Son is growing. She has blue eyes like the sky above your camp." Another read, "They call my child, the American. I tell them she was born under mercy, not under flags." Parker read each one at her desk and folded them neatly into a tin box, as if preserving a fragile truth no government could archive. Outside, Camp Herne was changing too. The barbed wire fences were being dismantled, the guard towers torn down for scrap. Trucks hauled away wooden signs once marked, POW area. The soldiers, eager to go home, treated the dismantling like a farewell ritual, swinging hammers into planks, laughing as if to erase what the place had meant. But for Parker, every board removed felt like a page being torn from a book before it was finished. Lieutenant Colonel Harris returned from a meeting in Washington with news that the camp would close entirely by spring. "They want it forgotten," he said quietly. "The war's over, and mercy doesn't sell headlines." Parker looked at him, tired but defiant. "You can't erase what happened here." Harris sighed. "No. But history's selective. It keeps what flatters it." On Christmas Eve, Parker walked alone through the remnants of the camp. The Texas wind was sharp, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, townsfolk were singing carols, their voices carried on the same wind that once rustled through rows of barracks. She stopped by the flagpole, where the stars and stripes hung motionless in the still air. Beneath it, she imagined the faces of those women, their disbelief, their gratitude, their quiet dignity. It struck her that their children had entered the world beneath this flag, not as citizens, but as reminders. Symbols of what mercy looked like when painted in red, white, and blue. Weeks later, Parker received orders to report to another facility near San Antonio. She packed slowly, unwilling to leave the ghost of her post behind. Before she locked her desk, she took out the tin box of letters one last time. She hesitated, then slipped it into her suitcase. Some truths, she decided, belonged to the living. The train ride south passed through open country, miles of gold grass her own ears. Annalise stared at her, eyes wide. "What about the babies?" Parker hesitated. "They'll go with you. And milk? Medicine? We'll see what can be done." The silence that followed felt heavier than any gunfire Parker had heard during the war. That night, the women refused to sleep. They gathered in small groups, whispering in the dim light of oil lamps, their voices weaving through the air like threads of mourning. Some prayed. Others sang softly, German lullabies mixing with the cries of infants. The camp, once a place of reluctant safety, felt like it was holding its breath. Outside, the guards pretended not to listen, though many did. One private later said it sounded like church at the end of the world. At dawn, Parker walked the length of the fence. She watched the women packing what little they owned, blankets, hand-sewn baby clothes, the bottles that had once seemed eternal. The first truck waited near the gate. A soldier approached her with the transfer manifest. "Orders from HQ," he said quietly. "They'll be gone by noon." She nodded, unable to speak. As she turned back toward the infirmary, she noticed Annalise standing by the fence, holding her daughter close. "You told me mercy doesn't end," she said. "Was that a lie?" Parker met her gaze, words failing. Around them, the camp was alive with motion. Soldiers shouting, engines starting, infants crying, but in that instant everything stilled. "Maybe it doesn't end," Parker said finally. "Maybe it just moves." Annalise nodded slowly, understanding what Parker could not say aloud, that mercy had become a traveler, leaving one camp to seek another. As the trucks pulled away, the dust rose high, veiling the departing figures like ghosts of history itself. Parker stood at the gate until they vanished. Behind her, the empty cribs gleamed faintly in the sunlight, lined up like unanswered questions. That evening, when the telegram's copy was filed, an officer added a note in neat cursive at the bottom of the page. Maternity ward successfully closed. No further births recorded. But the ledger in Parker's drawer told another story. Next to the final entry, Annalise, infant son, she had written one last line before the ink dried. "Mercy, once given, cannot be recalled." Outside, the first chill of November crept across the plains, and in the wind that rattled the barbed wire, it almost sounded like a whisper, a reminder that compassion, once spoken aloud, refuses to stay silent. Winter came early that year, pressing its breath against the wooden walls of Camp Hearn. The war was long over, but the camp's silence felt heavier than when the guns still spoke. The maternity ward stood abandoned now in empty skies. Across the aisle, a soldier returning from Japan snored against the window. Parker watched the land roll by, thinking of Annalise and Marta, of the quiet courage it took to cradle a newborn in a stranger's land. She wondered if the babies, now nearly a year old, would remember any trace of that sunlight filtered through Baroque windows, or the smell of pine soap and cotton sheet. Probably not. But perhaps the memory lived elsewhere, in the mothers or maybe in herself. At her new post, Parker found herself assigned to civilian repatriation efforts. Her work now involved logistics, not life. Names on lists, cargo manifests, medical clearances. Yet every few weeks another letter arrived, forwarded from Hearn. "The Americans gave us food for the journey. Son laughs when I say Texas. She thinks it is a kind of bird." Another, "People stare at me when they see her light hair. I tell them kindness can change the color of things." Months passed. Europe stumbled through its broken rebirth. Refugees returned to crumbling homes. Nations redrew their maps with trembling hands. In Germany, some of the mothers reunited, bound by a secret thread of shared experience. They met in ruined churches and whispered about the camp where mercy lived. Their children, born in captivity, under the flag of their conquerors, grew up hearing stories that sounded half like myth. In 1947, Parker received a package with no return address. Inside was a small photograph, a toddler in a knitted dress standing in a field of wildflowers. On the back, written in delicate German, "For the nurse who taught us that even enemies have hearts." Parker stared at the photo for a long time. She placed it on her nightstand beside her rosary and whispered, "No, my dear. You taught us." Time, as always, moved on. By the 1950s, most Americans had forgotten the camps existed at all. The farmland reclaimed the land where the barracks once stood. A water tower rose in place of the infirmary. But occasionally, when local children dug in the soil, they'd find something: an old spoon, a button, a fragment of glass etched with the faint mark of the Red Cross. Artifacts of an invisible kindness. Years later, Parker returned to Hearn on a whim. She was older now, her hair gray, her hands unsteady. The place was almost unrecognizable, fields stretched where fences had once glimmered in the sun. A local historian guided her around what little remained. "Most folks don't believe this was a POW camp," he said. "But some of us keep the stories alive." She smiled faintly. "Keep this one," she told him. "It's the only war story that ends in birth." As dusk settled, she walked to the place where the flagpole had once stood. She closed her eyes and imagined the sound of crying infants, of German lullabies mingling with the murmur of English prayers. She thought of those women stepping off ships in Bremerhaven, babies bundled in American blankets, their eyes fixed on the gray horizon of a country learning to rebuild. The world had called them enemies, but in the quiet spaces between cruelty and forgiveness, they had been something else, proof that decency could outlast the dust of war. Parker reached into her coat and unfolded the final letter she had received, one she'd carried for years. My daughter is 5 now. She plays with children of every nation. When she asks me what America is, I tell her, it's the place where kindness wore a uniform. Parker smiled through her tears. The wind moved gently through the grass, soft as breath. She turned to leave but paused once more, looking toward the horizon where the sky burned orange and violet. Mercy in uniform, she whispered. That's what they'll never write in the textbooks. Then she laughed quietly to herself, a sound of both sorrow and pride. As she walked away, the camera of history would linger on the empty field, the fading light, the invisible footprints of women who had once been enemies but left behind something indestructible. For beyond the barbed wire, beyond the bitterness of victory, life had been born, under an enemy's flag, yes, but into a world just beginning to remember its humanity. And somewhere, across an ocean, a little girl named San looked up at the same sky and asked her mother a question that echoed through time. Mama, what color is kindness?